The base camp had always been a place of noise, metal clanging against metal, the rumble of armored vehicles, bursts of laughter and cursing from squads returning from patrol. Yet within that constant chaos, one figure always seemed to move like a shadow, present but unnoticed. Her name was Corporal Elena Hayes, though most of the soldiers simply referred to her as the Quiet Medic. She had been deployed with the infantry unit for nearly 3 months, and in all that time she rarely raised her voice above a soft, steady tone. While others boasted about kills, swapped outrageous stories, or argued over card games, Elena often sat silently at the edge of the firelight, stitching torn uniforms or writing in her small, battered notebook. Many of the men thought she was timid, unsuited for the rough violence of war. They mocked her under their breath, saying she was too fragile, too quiet, too bookish to handle the madness they lived in. In a place where bravado was currency, her calm restraint was treated like weakness. Some of the jokes were harmless, the sort of ribbing that soldiers used to break the tension, but others had a sharper edge. "Hey Doc," one of the sergeants would call out when she passed, "you sure you can carry that pack? Don't want you falling over in the field." Laughter would ripple through the squad, and Elena would simply adjust the straps and keep moving. She never snapped back, never tried to prove herself with words. If anything, her silence fueled more taunts. They called her Ghost, Mute Medic, and sometimes even Dead Weight. To them, she was a fragile civilian in uniform, tolerated only because the army needed someone to patch them up. But inside, Elena carried a quiet determination forged long before she ever set foot in the desert. She had watched her brother bleed out on the kitchen floor of their childhood home after a senseless accident, and she had sworn that never again would she stand helpless in the face of dying. Every tourniquet she tied, every vial of morphine she carried, was a promise to him. Her days blended into one another with the same steady rhythm. Clean wounds, change bandages, log supplies, check vitals, and then retreat to her corner to rest. It was thankless work, and the men rarely acknowledged the patience it required. They preferred the glamour of firefights and raids, where adrenaline roared in their veins and stories could be bragged about for years. To them, a medic was useful only when someone was already on the ground bleeding. Until that moment came, she was invisible. Elena accepted that invisibility without complaint, because she knew the war didn't reward noise. The war demanded readiness. So she kept herself sharp, memorizing every step of battlefield triage, drilling the motions of dragging a wounded body under cover, rehearsing in her head how she would work with bullets snapping past her ears. She didn't crave recognition, she craved the moment where her preparation would matter. The convoy rolled out one dawn under a sky stained with the faintest red, the air already sweltering. Elena sat wedged between 2 soldiers who hardly looked at her, their rifles resting across their knees. Dust churned behind the line of vehicles as they cut across the barren flats toward a small village suspected of harboring insurgents. Intelligence said it would be a routine search, but every man in the convoy knew routine was a dangerous word. It was on roads like these where the silence could break in an instant, where the dust could hide an ambush or an IED waiting to shred steel and flesh alike. Elena kept her pack close, her fingers brushing the edges of the bandages and morphine injectors inside. Her heartbeat was steady, almost unnaturally calm compared to the nervous chatter that filled the troop carrier. The others thought her quietness meant fear, but in truth, it was focus. When the blast came, it was like the earth itself had decided to erupt. The lead vehicle vanished in a fireball that rocked the convoy, metal shards slicing through the air. The troop carrier lurched sideways, soldiers shouting, some thrown against the steel walls. Gunfire followed immediately, sharp cracks from the ridgeline above the road. The convoy had been funneled into a kill zone, and the enemy opened fire with ruthless precision. Chaos exploded, orders being screamed, rifles snapping out bursts, men diving for cover in the dirt. Elena's ears rang, her body jolted by the shock wave, but her mind remained unervingly clear. She saw the wounded immediately, a private clutching his leg as blood poured through his fingers, another slumped motionless against the side of the vehicle. Training took over. Without hesitation, she yanked her pack open, dragged the nearest soldier behind a wheel well, and pressed a tourniquet high on his thigh. Bullets kicked up dirt inches away, but her hands did not shake. The soldiers around her fought back fiercely, returning fire with controlled bursts, trying to suppress the ambush. The sergeant who had mocked her most often was now pinned down, a crimson line cutting across his shoulder. He looked at Elena with disbelief as she crawled toward him, low to the ground, dragging supplies behind her. He expected her to hesitate, to flinch, but she didn't. She pressed her hand to his wound, her eyes locking onto his for the first time since deployment, and said firmly, "You'll live. Keep firing." It wasn't a boast, not a shout, just a statement of fact delivered in that same calm voice they had always mocked. For the first time, he listened. The gunfire raged on, rattling through the narrow pass with no sign of letting up. Dust and smoke mingled in the hot air, making every breath taste of metal and grit. The convoy had been thrown into a desperate scramble, soldiers shouting over the deafening roar of rifles and machine guns. Amid the chaos, Elena kept moving. She slid from one man to the next, her uniform darkened with sweat and streaked with blood that wasn't her own. Her quiet presence cut through the panic like a steady current. Wherever she went, wounds were closed, bleeding slowed, and broken men found the strength to hold on. A cry from behind the overturned truck tore through the noise. Elena scrambled over debris, crouched low as bullets hammered the steel plating inches above her head. She found Private Lewis crumpled against the dirt, his chest rising in shallow, ragged breaths. A piece of shrapnel had torn into his side, and every cough sprayed red across his chin. The young soldier's eyes were wild with terror, searching desperately for someone to save him. Elena pressed her hand against his wound, feeling the warmth of his life leaking away. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice calm even as tracer rounds screamed overhead. She packed gauze into the wound, her motions efficient, almost surgical, despite the battlefield raging around her. She could hear the gunfire dimly, but in her mind there was only the rhythm of her breathing, the pulse under her fingers, the methodical checklist she had rehearsed 1,000 times. Another explosion thundered close by, shaking the ground. Soldiers cursed, firing back toward the ridgeline. A corporal shouted that they were surrounded. Elena tuned it out. Her world in that moment was only Lewis, the fragile rise and fall of his chest. She pulled a syringe of morphine, steadied his trembling hand and pushed it into his arm. His eyes fluttered, fear dimming to something softer. "You're not done yet," she told him, securing the bandage with strips of torn fabric before signaling 2 others to drag him behind cover. Lewis reached out weakly, gripping her wrist before they carried him away. His lips formed a thank you she barely heard, but she saw it in his eyes. She nodded once, then turned back toward the chaos. There were more voices crying out, more bodies sprawled in the dust, and she moved toward them without hesitation. By now the soldiers had noticed. Between bursts of fire, they caught glimpses of her crawling into the kill zone, dragging men to safety, her hands always steady. The same soldiers who had laughed at her silence now yelled for her with desperate urgency. "Medic! Over here! Doc, he's hit bad." Their voices carried fear, but also trust, the kind that only comes when life hangs on the edge of a medic's hands. Elena didn't stop to think about what they once called her. She simply answered every cry. She stitched torn flesh with bullets cracking past, jammed tourniquets into place, slapped men back to consciousness with firm orders to stay alive. Her soft voice, once a target of mockery, became the anchor holding them together in the storm. Then came Sergeant Dalton. He had been leading the squad at the front when the ambush hit, and now he lay sprawled in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him from a jagged wound across his abdomen. 2 soldiers were already crouched by his side, their rifles useless in the narrow gap between panic and despair. Elena slid in beside him, her knees sinking into the dust. The wound was bad, deep, ugly and bleeding fast. Dalton's face was ashen, his jaw clenched against the pain. When his eyes found hers, recognition flickered. "Quiet medic," he rasped, almost bitter, as though mocking himself for all the times he had doubted her. Elena didn't flinch. She tore open her kit, pressed a sealant patch against the wound and leaned close. "Quiet keeps me focused," she said evenly, voice cutting through his groans. "Now shut up and breathe." The men around her stared as she worked, their rifles forgotten for a moment as they watched her pour every ounce of skill and composure into keeping Dalton alive. She pressed, sealed, wrapped, and injected, her movements flowing in a rhythm that was almost artful. Dalton's breathing steadied, though faint, and his eyes, clouded with pain, locked onto her with something that looked a lot like respect. For the first time, the mocking sergeant had nothing to say. Above them, the firefight raged on. The enemy pressed hard, pinning the convoy down with relentless bursts. But something was shifting. The soldiers, fueled by the sight of their medic risking everything without hesitation, fought with renewed ferocity. They covered her as she moved, laying down fire to give her seconds to reach another wounded man. Every time she crawled into the open, hearts clenched in fear, but she always returned, dragging another body to safety. She wasn't just healing wounds, she was keeping the unit alive in spirit, showing them that courage didn't always shout, Sometimes it moved quietly, steadily, with hands that refused to shake. As the firefight stretched into its brutal second hour, the men realized they had already lost count of how many she had saved. 5, 6, maybe more. And still she didn't slow. Elena's body ached, her uniform soaked with sweat and blood, but she pushed it aside. She could rest later. For now, she was the thin line between life and death, and she refused to let that line break. The ambush showed no signs of ending. Hours in battle could feel like minutes and minutes like lifetimes, but Elena had learned to measure time differently, by heartbeats, by the ragged gasps of men struggling against pain, by the dwindling number of bandages and morphine injectors in her pack. Her supplies were running thin, and yet the cries for help never ceased. She crawled through dust and smoke, dragging her battered kit with her, ignoring the burn of shrapnel that had grazed her thigh earlier. Every man she reached was another piece of the unit held together, another thread refusing to snap under the enemy's attempt to cut them apart. At one point, she ducked into the wreckage of a burning vehicle where a soldier lay pinned beneath twisted steel. The flames licked dangerously close, heat searing her skin, but she shoved aside the panic and focused. The man's leg was trapped, blood pumping steadily from a deep gash. Without hesitation, Elena jammed a tourniquet above the wound and cinched it tight. His screams echoed inside the steel shell, but his pulse steadied once the bleeding slowed. She braced herself against the metal and heaved, trying to free his leg, but the wreckage was immovable. Gritting her teeth, she yelled for help, her voice sharp and commanding, carrying further than anyone had ever heard it before. 2 soldiers rushed in, their eyes wide at the sight of her framed against the fire. Together they pulled the man free, dragging him out just before the flames consumed the wreck. The men stared at her with something close to awe, but she ignored it, already kneeling to finish dressing the wound. She had no time for awe. The enemy pressed harder. Mortar rounds landed near the convoy, throwing up walls of dust and rock. One blast sent Elena sprawling, her ears ringing, blood trickling down from where her helmet had slammed against the ground. For a split second, the world was nothing but a high-pitched whine and a haze of pain. Then through the fog she heard it, a weak, desperate cry, "Medic!" She forced herself to move, shaking her head until her vision cleared. Crawling on raw instinct, she followed the sound until she found a young private half-buried beneath debris, his face pale, one arm twisted unnaturally. Elena shoved rocks away, freeing his chest so he could breathe. Her own head throbbed violently, but she pushed the pain aside, splinting his arm and injecting him with morphine before guiding him toward safety. She never once looked back at the blood on her own face. By now, the unit had stopped underestimating her. The soldiers who once mocked her for being quiet were shouting to each other, "Cover the medic! Give Doc some space!" They fired in coordinated bursts, shielding her movements with suppressive fire. In their eyes, she wasn't invisible anymore, she was the reason they still had a chance to survive. Even Sergeant Dalton, pale and weak from his wound, barked orders with new urgency to protect her. She had saved him, and now he would see her reach others. The respect she had never demanded was now given freely, born from the raw proof of her courage. But courage came at a cost. Elena could feel her body breaking down. Her lungs burned from smoke, her hands shook not from fear but from exhaustion, and her water canteen was long empty. Yet every time she thought she might falter, another soldier cried out, another body slumped into the dust, and she moved again. Each rescue carried her deeper into the kill zone, further from safety. The risk didn't matter. She had always told herself she wasn't here for glory, she was here for lives. If that meant sacrificing her own, she was willing. At one point, she crawled toward a soldier hit in the neck, blood pumping in terrifying spurts. She pressed her hands hard against the wound, feeling his life surge beneath her palms. The man gasped, choking, his eyes wide with panic. Elena leaned close, speaking directly into his ears so he could hear her over the chaos. "Stay with me. Look at me. You're not going anywhere today." Her voice was calm but firm, her tone the same she had used dozens of times before, but now it carried the weight of absolute certainty. The soldier clung to that certainty, his trembling slowing, his breaths ragged but steadying as she sealed the wound with pressure bandages. Another man dragged him away under covering fire, shouting Elena's name with gratitude she didn't pause to hear. As the firefight dragged into its third brutal hour, the survivors realized a strange truth: they were still alive largely because of her. 7 men who should have been dead were instead breathing, thanks to her hands. In a battle designed to break them, Elena had held them together. Her quiet strength was no longer mocked, it was revered. The same soldiers who once jeered now glanced at her with something almost reverent, as though she were the heart of their unit. They had thought bravery meant shouting louder, shooting straighter, standing taller. But now they understood. Sometimes bravery was silent, crawling through dust with bandages instead of bullets, choosing to face death not by inflicting it but by defying it. And still the battle was not over. The enemy was regrouping, their fire intensifying. The unit was pinned, their ammunition running low, their vehicles crippled. Elena's kit was nearly empty, her bandages used, her morphine gone. Yet as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the battlefield, she looked out at the soldiers around her, men battered, bleeding but alive, and felt the same calm she always carried. She knew what they didn't, that her role wasn't finished, that even with nothing left in her pack, she would find a way to keep them standing. Quiet didn't mean weak. Quiet meant unshakable. And in the hours still to come, they would see just how unshakable she could be. The sun was sinking behind the jagged ridges, staining the sky in molten hues of orange and red as the firefight entered its most desperate stage. Ammunition belts were running short, rifle magazines nearly empty. The convoy, once a picture of strength, now looked like a graveyard of steel, burning vehicles, shredded tires, black smoke curling into the evening air. The men huddled behind what little cover remained, their nerves stretched thin. Fear was etched into every face, but none dared give voice to it. What kept them from unraveling was not their dwindling firepower or the thin hope of reinforcements, but the presence of the woman who moved steadily among them with blood on her hands and quiet determination in her eyes. Elena Hayes, the quiet medic they had mocked for weeks, had become their anchor. She crouched beside a soldier with a mangled arm, tying the last of her clean bandages around the wound. Her kit was nearly bare now. Gauze had been replaced with strips of torn uniforms, morphine syringes were long gone, and tourniquets had been improvised from belts and rifle slings. Yet she made do, her ingenuity as relentless as her focus. The wounded groaned and gasped around her, but they lived, and every breath they drew fueled the squad's will to fight on. When she tightened the makeshift dressing, the soldier hissed in pain, but Elena's voice was calm and steady. Pain means you're alive. Hold on to that. Her words, simple and firm, cut deeper than any speech could. The enemy fire grew heavier, a storm of bullets and mortars raining from the ridgeline. Dirt and shrapnel showered over the convoy, rattling against helmets and tearing into steel. A private crouched nearby flinched and shouted that they were finished, his voice high with panic. Before anyone else could respond, Elena turned her head sharply, her face streaked with grime and blood, and said, "Not while I'm here." The tone was not loud, not commanding like an officer's, but it carried a conviction so absolute that it silenced the boy instantly. Even Dalton, still pale from his wound but propped against a crate with his rifle ready, gave her a grim nod. "You heard the doc," he rasped. "We're not done yet." As the minutes dragged into what felt like hours, the soldiers fought with grim determination. Every shot was measured, every burst meant to buy time. Elena moved like a ghost among them, fearless in the open as she dragged the wounded behind scraps of cover. Twice she crossed open ground under heavy fire to reach men who had fallen too far out. Bullets tore the dirt around her, but she never faltered, her focus fixed on the faces that needed her. Each time she returned, hauling another wounded soldier into safety, the men erupted with covering fire, their trust in her absolute. She had saved 7 already, and none dared doubt she would save more if the chance arose. At one point, as the fire slackened momentarily, Elena sank against a shattered wheel rim, her breath ragged. Her hands trembled from exhaustion, her muscles screaming in protest. For a fleeting moment, the weight of it all pressed against her, the faces of the wounded, the blood soaking her uniform, the relentless fear of failing even one of them. But then she remembered her brother, the helpless night she had sworn never to repeat. She looked at the soldiers around her, bruised and battered yet alive, and forced herself upright. Pain was irrelevant. She was not finished. Then the call came over the radio. Reinforcements were en route, but still at least an hour away. An hour. To men low on ammunition and hope, an hour felt like eternity. The squad braced themselves for the possibility they would not last that long. The enemy seemed to sense it too, their gunfire intensifying in a final push to wipe out what remained of the convoy. Tracers lit the twilight like burning comets, slicing through the smoke-filled air. The ridge above blazed with muzzle flashes, the enemy relentless in their assault. Dalton barked orders, rallying the squad to hold their line. But the truth was clear. They were running on fumes both in bullets and in strength. That was when Elena did something no one expected. Slinging her empty pack aside, she grabbed the rifle of a fallen soldier, not to fight, but to crawl toward the front line. The men shouted after her, thinking she'd lost her mind, but she ignored them, dragging a box of ammunition with her. Under fire, she shoved it toward the machine gunner pinned behind a half-destroyed Humvee. "Keep them busy," she said simply, her voice calm even as rounds pinged off the metal around her. The gunner blinked at her, stunned, then loaded the belt and unleashed a torrent of fire that forced the enemy to duck for cover. Her actions bought the squad precious moments. Moments to breathe, to reload, to regroup. And in that fragile pause, the men realized something profound. Elena wasn't just saving lives, she was keeping the fight itself alive. They had mocked her silence, called her weak, but here she was outlasting them all, carrying them forward when everything else threatened to collapse. Her quietness was not weakness. It was strength carved in steel and blood. The battle stretched into the night, the world lit only by muzzle flashes and the orange glow of burning vehicles. Elena moved through the darkness like a wraith, whispering encouragement to the wounded, dragging bodies when her own strength was nearly gone, and holding pressure on wounds until her arms ached. By the time the distant rumble of friendly armor finally echoed across the flats, she was kneeling over her seventh soldier, her hands soaked in blood but steady as ever, refusing to let him slip away. The men who had once called her dead weight now watched her with silent reverence. They knew without a shadow of doubt, if they survived this night, it would be because of her. The first sound of approaching reinforcements was faint, carried on the wind like a distant growl of thunder. At first, the soldiers didn't trust it. After hours of unrelenting fire, their ears rang with phantom noises, and hope had become a dangerous thing. But then the low rumble of armored engines grew clearer, undeniable, followed by the heavy thud of artillery from friendly guns hammering the ridgeline. The enemy fire faltered, tracers thinning as insurgents scrambled to retreat under the sudden pressure. Relief swept the convoy like a tide, but it was not the roaring, triumphant kind. It was ragged, exhausted, the kind born from surviving too long on the edge of death. Many of the men collapsed against the wreckage, too drained even to cheer. Their eyes searched for the one figure who had kept them alive long enough to see this moment. Elena was crouched over her seventh patient, a young corporal whose chest had been ripped open by shrapnel. Her hands, slick with blood, pressed down firmly on the dressing she had improvised from the last scraps of cloth. The man's eyes rolled back, his breathing shallow, but she refused to let him slip away. "Stay with me," she whispered, the words steady despite her body trembling from exhaustion. She didn't look up when the rumble of friendly armor grew louder, or when cheers broke out across the line. To her, the battle wasn't over until every man who could be saved was breathing. When at last the medics from the reinforcements rushed in with fresh supplies and stretchers, they found her still holding the wound, refusing to release her pressure even as her arms shook violently. "Ma'am, we've got him," one of the medics told her gently, laying a firm hand on her shoulder. Elena hesitated for a moment, her bloodshot eyes locked on the soldier beneath her, then nodded and let them take over. Her body sagged backward, her strength finally faltering now that she knew he was in other hands. For the first time since the ambush began, she allowed herself to lean against the wreckage and breathe. Her uniform was soaked through, her helmet dented, her hands raw from hours of work. She looked less like the quiet medic the squad had mocked and more like a figure carved from the battlefield itself, hardened by fire and smoke. The reinforcements secured the area quickly, driving the enemy from the ridgeline and setting up a perimeter. Stretchers lined the ground, each bearing the bodies of the wounded and the fallen. Helicopters thumped overhead, their searchlights cutting through the smoke as they prepared to evacuate casualties. The squad moved among them, battered but alive, their faces drawn with exhaustion and disbelief. 7 of their own had been saved when by all rights they should have been dead. And every single one of them owed it to Elena. Dalton, his abdomen still wrapped in the sealant she had pressed against him hours ago, pushed himself onto his elbows as medics tried to lay him down. He ignored their protests, his eyes fixed on Elena. She sat a few feet away, her head bowed, hair matted with dust and sweat, her hands trembling in her lap. She looked utterly spent but also utterly unbroken. "You did it, Doc," Dalton croaked, his voice hoarse but carrying. "You kept us alive." The men nearby turned their heads at his words. For a long time, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the distant thud of retreating gunfire. Then one soldier, voice rough with emotion, said, "She didn't just keep us alive. She carried us." The words rippled through the squad, unspoken truths finding voice. They had mocked her quiet, dismissed her presence, treated her as if she were little more than baggage. Now they saw her for what she truly was, the backbone of their survival, the steady flame that refused to be extinguished when everything else fell apart. One by one they nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude. It wasn't pity or relief or even admiration, it was respect, the kind forged only in blood and fire. Elena barely acknowledged them. She wasn't thinking about their words, or how their views had shifted. She was thinking of the 7 men who would see another sunrise, who would have a chance to go home, to live. That was what mattered. She had never cared about recognition, only results. And yet, as she looked up at their faces, tired, bloodied, but alive, she felt something stir in her chest. Not pride, exactly, but a quiet affirmation that her silence had never been weakness. It had been strength, the kind that spoke loudest in action rather than words. As the helicopters began to lift off, carrying the most critical wounded toward the field hospital, the squad prepared to follow. Elena stood slowly, her body aching, her legs unsteady. Dalton reached out a bloodied hand to steady her, and for once she accepted the gesture. "Quiet medic, huh?" he muttered, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable, then simply replied, "Quiet gets the job done." He chuckled weakly, wincing from the pain, but his eyes held none of the mockery they once did. Only respect. When the last stretcher was loaded and the dust from the rotors settled, the survivors climbed into the transports. They were a smaller unit now, scarred and weary, but bound by something deeper than orders or ranks. As the vehicles rumbled back toward base under the protection of armored escorts, the men leaned back in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Yet every so often their eyes would drift toward Elena, who sat with her blood-stained pack in her lap, her gaze distant. They didn't need to say it aloud. They all knew the truth. She hadn't just saved 7 soldiers. She had saved them all. The camp had been buzzing for hours with stories of Sarah's bravery, but when the adrenaline wore off, the weight of everything that had happened began to sink into her bones. She sat alone near the edge of the field hospital, the night unusually silent except for the occasional crackle of distant gunfire. Her hands were still trembling, though she clenched them into fists to stop the shaking. She had patched wounds, dragged men out of a firefight and stared death in the face. Yet now, in the quiet, her mind replayed it all like a broken reel, blood on her gloves, cries for help, the echo of bullets, the moment she thought she wouldn't survive. One of the soldiers she had saved earlier limped toward her, leaning heavily on a crutch. His face was pale, but his eyes shone with gratitude. "Medic," he rasped, lowering himself beside her, "you kept me alive today. You could have left me. No one would have blamed you. But you didn't." Sarah shook her head, her voice low. "Leaving you wasn't an option. I was scared, but I couldn't just stand by." The man chuckled weakly, though it turned into a cough. "Scared? We all thought you were fearless. You walked through hell like it was nothing." She glanced down, ashamed. "I was terrified the entire time." She swallowed hard. "But fear doesn't mean we stop moving. It just means we move anyway." The soldier nodded slowly, his respect deepening. For the first time since she had joined this unit, Sarah felt seen not just as a medic, but as someone worth following. It was strange, almost overwhelming, to know that her actions had shifted their perception of her so drastically in a single day. Later that evening, Captain Miller summoned her to the command tent. Inside, the dim glow of lanterns threw shadows across maps littered with markers. The captain's expression was heavy but softened when he saw her. "Sarah," he said firmly, "what you did out there saved lives. More than I can count. I'm not exaggerating when I say the tide turned because of you." Her throat tightened. She wasn't used to this kind of acknowledgement. "I just did my job, sir." The captain leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "No. You went far beyond your job. You showed courage when everyone else was pinned down. You carried men under fire without hesitation. That's not just being a medic, that's being a soldier." The words hit her harder than any bullet could have. For months she had lived under the shadow of doubt from the others, branded as the quiet medic, who lacked the fire of a fighter. But now, those doubts had been shattered not only in their eyes, but in her own. Still, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the men who hadn't made it. For every soldier she dragged to safety, another had fallen beyond her reach. That guilt gnawed at her as she stood in the command tent, listening to the captain's praise. "Sir," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I couldn't save everyone." The captain's gaze softened further. "No one ever can. But you gave 7 men another chance at life. That is a miracle on a battlefield like this. Don't let the ones you couldn't save erase the worth of the ones you did." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. She nodded stiffly, saluted, and stepped out into the cool night. As she walked back toward the medical tents, soldiers along the way straightened when they saw her. Some nodded, some whispered, some gave her small salutes of their own. It was subtle, but it was undeniable. She wasn't invisible anymore. The girl they had mocked as timid and soft-spoken had earned her place in their eyes. Back at the tents, she resumed her duties, checking on the wounded, adjusting bandages, whispering reassurances. Her quietness hadn't left her, it never would, but now it carried weight, authority, and trust. When she placed a hand on a soldier's shoulder and said, "You'll be all right," they believed her. When she gave orders for more supplies or instructed someone to hold pressure on a wound, no one second-guessed her. Yet even as respect grew around her, Sarah carried her own private war inside. Every cry from the day still echoed in her chest. Every face she couldn't reach haunted her when she closed her eyes. The battlefield demanded resilience, but resilience often came with scars deeper than flesh. That night, unable to sleep, she sat outside the tent with a lantern and her medical journal. She wrote down the names of the 7 soldiers she had saved, their injuries, and the steps she had taken. But this time she also wrote something she had never written before: "Fear does not define me. What I choose to do in fear does." When she closed the journal, the lantern light caught her expression. Still quiet, still solemn, but no longer uncertain. The quiet medic hadn't changed into someone new. She had simply revealed the strength that had always been there, hidden beneath doubt and silence. And now, every soldier in the camp knew it. As dawn crept over the horizon, Sarah rose to begin another day. There would be more battles, more wounds, more chances to prove herself. But whether mocked or praised, she had found her truth. She was more than their labels, more than her fear. She was the medic who ran into Gunfire, and that was something no one would ever forget. The days that followed the ambush carried a strange quiet across the base. Word of Emily's heroics had already reached higher command, yet she moved through the camp with the same quiet humility as always, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, her boots caked in the same dust as everyone else's. The men she had saved looked at her with something deeper than gratitude. It was a mixture of awe and shame. Awe because she had braved death to pull them out from under fire. Shame because many of them had once mocked her as the quiet medic, the woman too reserved to be noticed. Now she was a figure they could not ignore. But Emily never sought the spotlight. She spent her days checking the soldiers' wounds, replacing bandages, ensuring infections did not take hold. She walked among them softly, never boasting, never reminding anyone of what she had done. Yet every pair of eyes followed her as if waiting for the next quiet miracle. The commanding officer, Colonel Abrams, summoned her one evening. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the compound. Inside his office, the walls lined with maps and reports, Abrams fixed his gaze on Emily. "What you did out there," he began, his voice carrying the gravelly weight of years in the field, "was not just brave, it was extraordinary. You saved 7 men under direct fire. That is the kind of courage we give medals for." Emily shifted uncomfortably. She had no desire for medals or recognition. She wanted only to keep her comrades alive. "Sir," she answered softly, "I was just doing my duty. They needed me. That's all." Abrams leaned back, studying her. "That humility of yours, don't think it hides you. The men talk about you. They're not mocking you anymore. They're learning from you." Despite his words, Emily could sense the unease in the camp. While many soldiers admired her now, some wrestled with pride, unable to reconcile their past dismissive attitudes with the truth they had seen. One evening in the mess hall, a younger private approached her table. His name was Miller, one of the men she had dragged out from under enemy fire. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Ma'am, I owe you my life. I called you names before. I said you were weak. I'm sorry." Emily looked at him, her expression calm, almost maternal. "You don't need to apologize," she said. "You're alive. That's enough for me." Her words cut deeper than any lecture could. Miller sat in silence, tears brimming as the rest of the room listened. In that moment, the walls of mockery that had once surrounded her completely collapsed. But war was not finished with them. The intelligence officers brought grim news. The enemy was preparing another assault, larger than the last, aimed at breaking their defenses entirely. Everyone knew casualties were inevitable. Emily, though weary, prepared herself once again. She checked her supplies obsessively: morphine, gauze, sutures for fluids. Each item was more precious than gold, for each meant the difference between life and death on the battlefield. As she packed, she overheard 2 soldiers talking outside her tent. "If anyone can keep us alive through this," one said, "it's her." The other replied, "The quiet medic?" She's more soldier than half of us. Emily paused, listening, her chest tight. She had never asked for their validation, yet hearing it stirred something inside her, a sense of belonging she had never felt before. The assault came at dawn 2 days later. Mortars thundered across the horizon, shaking the earth beneath their boots. Gunfire cracked through the air, relentless and deafening. Emily was in the thick of it once again, sprinting from one fallen soldier to the next, her hands steady despite the chaos. A bullet tore through the sleeve of her uniform, grazing her arm, but she ignored the pain, focusing instead on stabilizing a sergeant who had been hit in the chest. Her face was streaked with sweat and dust, her eyes sharp with purpose. Every time the soldiers saw her rushing forward, refusing to take cover until the wounded were safe, their own courage surged. She was no longer just their medic, she was their anchor, the one person who embodied what it meant to serve without fear. As the battle raged, Emily came across a young radio operator, barely 19, bleeding heavily from his leg. She dragged him into a shallow trench, tied a tourniquet, and spoke to him calmly as the explosions roared overhead. "Stay with me. You'll make it. Breathe with me." The boy's terrified eyes locked onto hers, and somehow, in the steadiness of her voice, he found the will to cling to life. Moments later, reinforcements arrived to secure their position, and Emily pressed on, her energy seemingly inexhaustible. By the time the sun reached its zenith, she had treated more than a dozen men, some of whom would have been long gone without her intervention. When the smoke finally cleared and the enemy retreated, the battlefield was littered with the scars of violence. Shattered equipment, craters, the smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. Yet among the survivors, a single name passed from lip to lip: Emily. She walked through the aftermath with blood-stained hands, her eyes tired but resolute. Soldiers reached out to touch her shoulder, nodding silently in respect. She had not only saved lives, she had given them courage in their darkest hour. That night, as the base mourned the dead and counted the wounded, Emily sat alone outside her tent, the stars glimmering faintly overhead. For the first time since she had arrived in this war zone, she allowed herself a deep breath. She was no longer invisible, no longer the medic mocked for her silence. She had become the quiet strength that held them all together. The day of the community-wide vote finally arrived. 4 weeks, the entire neighborhood had been buzzing with debates, discussions, and rumors about Marina's confrontation with the HOA and how Karen's manipulative tactics had finally been exposed. People who had once been silent were now speaking openly about their frustrations. For the first time, residents felt they had the power to change their future, and Marina stood at the center of it all. The community center was filled to the brim that morning. Rows of chairs were set up, but still many people had to stand at the back. The air was thick with tension, but also with anticipation. Some of the HOA members sat in their usual polished attire, trying to appear calm and authoritative, but their nervous fidgeting betrayed them. At the front table, Karen sat stiffly, her arms crossed tightly, her lips pursed in irritation. She still believed she could sway the crowd at the last minute. Marina entered quietly, wearing a simple dress with a confident smile. She didn't need to raise her voice or flaunt power. Her calm presence drew people in. She walked to the front, nodded politely to the crowd, and waited for the meeting to begin. The moderator, an older gentleman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. "We are here today to vote on whether the HOA should retain its current leadership or be dissolved in favor of a new community council. Both sides will speak and then we will cast our votes." Karen immediately jumped up. "This is ridiculous," she barked. "Our HOA has kept this neighborhood safe, orderly, and beautiful for years. Without us, this place would fall into chaos. You think outsiders like Marina understand our traditions? She's only been here a short while. Don't let a newcomer dismantle everything we've built." Her words carried sharpness, but instead of inspiring fear, they only deepened the frowns across the room. People had heard this tune too many times before. One resident stood up and called out, "Safe? Orderly? Or just controlled by fear?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen's face flushed red. When Marina's turn came, she didn't rush to the podium. She simply stood where she was and spoke with sincerity. "I moved here hoping for peace and community. What I found was control and intimidation. But I also found neighbors, good people, who just needed someone to remind them that they had a voice. This neighborhood does not belong to an HOA or to Karen. It belongs to all of us. Together we can build something better, fairer, kinder, and more welcoming." Her words weren't dramatic, but they struck directly into the hearts of those listening. Marina's strength was not in speeches but in truth, and the truth resonated. The moderator then announced, "It's time to vote." Ballots were passed out and residents carefully marked their choices. Some looked nervous, glancing around to ensure Karen wasn't watching. Others, emboldened by the weeks of evidence and Marina's courage, marked their ballots with steady hands. The counting began. Karen sat rigidly, her jaw tight, trying to project confidence, but inside she was unraveling. She tapped her foot impatiently, whispering angrily to the other board members. Finally, the moderator stood up, holding the results. By a vote of 72 to 15, the HOA is officially dissolved. A new community council will be formed with open elections. The room erupted with applause, cheers, and even tears. Some neighbors hugged each other, relieved to finally be free from years of oppressive rules and manipulations. Karen, however, stood frozen, her face pale. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You'll regret it. This neighborhood will fall apart without me." But her words were drowned out by the sound of celebration. People were no longer afraid. Marina stayed calm. She looked at Karen with empathy, not malice. "Karen, power built on fear never lasts. Maybe now, without it, you can find a way to truly be part of this community." Karen's eyes burned with frustration, but she had no response. For the first time she had been defeated, not by force but by truth and unity. Over the following weeks, the transformation in the neighborhood was remarkable. Without the oppressive HOA, neighbors began organizing volunteer groups to handle maintenance, beautification, and events. Children played freely in the park without being scolded. Families began greeting one another warmly instead of avoiding each other in fear of breaking a rule. Marina, though central to the change, never claimed leadership. She encouraged others to step forward, reminding them that strength came from shared responsibility, not from control. A new council was elected, composed of kind, reasonable people who wanted to serve, not dominate. One evening Marina stood by the lake, watching the sunset reflect off the water. Several neighbors joined her, bringing food, laughter, and music. For the first time since moving in, she felt the true sense of belonging she had longed for. A woman nearby smiled at Marina and said, "You didn't just defeat Karen, you gave us back our voices." "Thank you." Marina shook her head gently. "I didn't give you anything. You already had it. You just needed to remember." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the community celebrated, not just the end of Karen's rule, but the beginning of a new chapter. And in that moment, Marina realized that sometimes the bravest act isn't fighting fire with fire, but simply standing firm in truth until others see it too. The HOA was gone, but its downfall left behind something stronger: unity, trust, and the reminder that power belongs to the people, not those who seek to control them. For Marina, it was not just a victory. It was a lesson she and her neighbors would carry forever. The end.